The Gamesir X2 appeared out of nowhere and quickly became one of the most wanted Android controllers. With its switch style and a simple but effective telescopic systems, it allows you to turn your phone into a mobile console. Now let's meet its successor, who, I think, don't really came to replace it because it's a completely different beast, now including a phone cooler to ensure maximum performance while gaming. Let's see if it works or it's just an expensive decoration. Welcome back, I'm Claudio and this is Zero to Tech. The Gamesir X2 and the original Razer Kishi were very good controllers, but with the advent of the new Snapdragons, they have a small issue. You cannot use them with a phone cooler, and Gamesir thought the same and decided to solve that problem. The first thing we see is that they completely skip the box. If you remember, they have gone from a very well thought out box, to a simple one with a case inside, to a case with a simple cardboard to indicate the product, which is good. If the case is good enough, better to be a little greener. We open it to see the typical small box, which now comes with various accessories. It has a longer pair of sticks that once installed, a slightly different D-pad, and the caps for the sticks, which are the same as those added in the second version to improve grip. Also the documentation, and this time we don't have a stamp. There's a USB-A to USB-C cable, which has the Gamesir logos on it, but it's soft, so be careful with what you use it. And finally we have the controller. You can see it's much bigger and changes the telescopic system to 3 pieces, with the cooler as the centerpiece, and you can see its fan in the back. The cooler is the main reason for the change in size. From the front, it doesn't look much bigger than the X2, but on its side it's almost twice as wide, not to mention the weight. And you may think it's just an aluminum heatsink with a fan, like a computer, but it's not that simple. This cooler uses the Peltier effect, which is a type of semiconductor, like an LED, but instead of generating light when getting power, the Peltier transfers temperature from one of its sides to the other one. This means that if we put the cooling side on a hot surface, it helps move the heat faster, and therefore to cool it. It's not a new technology or something special. If it were, we will see it in more common applications like computers. The problem is that it's not very efficient, but it has worked well for phone coolers, and we can see why. If we just plug it and wait, we see how the temperature on its surface drops considerably. And before we test how effective it is, let's review what's changed in the rest of the controller. The front buttons are now bigger, and if you can see, now they come with the ABXY arrangement. No wait, rather BAYX. Yes, now you can change them. You can remove the buttons and arrange them as you like. They're held in place by magnets, and once they're on, there's no way they'll come off by accident. When pressing them, this time they use real switches. They feel softer, but the tactile feeling is not so clear. The functions buttons remain the same, and the screenshot button works exactly as the previous one. The shoulder buttons change their shape, and they feel the same. Unfortunately, R2 and L2 are still digital and not analog, something Gamesir should have changed. The D-pad is now raised above the controller and has 2 caps. The first one supposed to be a more traditional D-pad, and the second that is more concave and looks like the Umbrella Corp logo. But in general, there don't seem to be much difference between them. It also uses switches. The analog sticks are the same as the previous ones. They have enough travel and feel very smooth. You can even increase the travel by changing to the taller sticks included with the accessories. They have the same slippery surface, but with the included caps are much better to use. You can choose between being concave like the Xbox One or convex like the PlayStation ones. The USB connector is now on the other side, and now has more movement to accommodate more types of phones, which, by the way, now supports up to 175mm, so there is no current phone that would not fit. The grids that hold the phone now have more slope, and putting the phone is the same. First, you plug it and open it until it falls in place. The USB-C port for charging the phone is also on the other side, and still only works for charging. Now we have an additional USB-C port, which is used to power the cooler. The software is the same one as the X2, with almost all the same features. It allows you to update the firmware, test the controller, and explains how to use the gesture mode to play games that don't support the controller. And that's the most important things you need to note about the controller. So let's jump into the tests. And go right into the most important part for most, the analog sticks. Thankfully, Gamesir haven't decided to use the Switch-like sticks, unlike others. Razer! And the stick it uses feel good, especially when you put the caps on it. The problem they had before has been poor calibration. Unfortunately, these have the same problem. I don't know if it's something physical with the sticks or something in software, but we can see the figure it draws is far from rounded. The left stick has some bias to the right, and vice versa. See how both sticks make a different shape in the upper left corner, and when trying to fill the whole figure, there is a little bit of a dead zone, which is mainly noticeable when changing direction, and that doesn't make it easy to fill the circle. In short, not much has changed. But before, this had not been a big issue while playing, so let's try them with games. We start with the most common use, shooters. We tried them with Fortnite, and really, there is not much to say. They work almost perfectly. You can feel those dead zones while aiming, but you will get used to it quickly. They compensate well thanks to the long travel, and you will not have a problem with the movement. To continue testing other shooters, as we saw with the Gamesir X2, the Gamesir apps gives you the gesture mode, or mapping mode. This is activated by pressing the select and home buttons at the same time, and it's marked by changing the LED to a lighter blue. We add the game to the app and launch it from there. In the game, it shows us an icon with a gamepad that, when pressed, allows us to set the position of the buttons and the sticks on the screen. We tested it as usual with Call of Duty Mobile and it works quite well. It's not the same as having a native controller, but good enough to enjoy unsupported games like this and Genshin Impact. The dead zones make short movements harder than they should be. Another problem is that the app sometimes shows the on-screen controls even if you're not in a game that needs them. And I found no way to remove them other than restarting the phone, or more drastically, uninstall the app. Even removing the permission for the overlay did not remove them from the screen, a problem they should solve. We tried Rush Rally to see how it worked with car games. Obviously, we don't have analog buttons for acceleration and braking, but just to try how the sticks behave. And the dead zone really hampers the experience. You should be able to make minimal adjustments to the steering, just by touching the stick. But here, you touch it just a little bit and nothing happens. Then, you press harder and you go over. Far from ideal. And the same thing happened with Forza Motorsport on xCloud. But playing Halo was no problem. The same as Fortnite, the stick has a very good travel and are good for aiming. The other problem we found in xCloud is that the front buttons are not in the right place. And it's such a dumb issue. With the X2, you couldn't physically change the labels of the buttons, but you could change their position with the app. Now, you can physically change them, but they didn't think to put the same option in the app, so no matter what the label says, A is still this button. And that's wrong, it should be here. Really, these engineers seem to barely think. As far as the D-pad is concerned, we have a major setback. Definitely not as good as the original 2. They wanted to make it interchangeable, maybe to copy the Xbox Elite 2, but it didn't work. Since it has 2 caps, I had to run the test twice, and the results are more interesting than I thought. The one with the cross is better in the accuracy test, but it has so much height and pivot that it's absurdly easy to mix directions, and it's going to happen by accident while playing. Even more so with the umbrella cap. And the two feel very small, like your finger barely fits in the contour of the cap. To the contrary, in the sequence tests, the cross one makes it difficult to do the sequences, although you can get used to it. Here the umbrella cap is better, but I ended up pressing it more on the edge than the center, similar to an analog stick. It's not a D-pad you're going to want to use for very long. A pity. In the second version of the X2, they have already solved the problems of the original. And it was good enough. Not the best, but good enough to play without too many complaints. A shame. Very well, now we're going to check this new cooler. As I mentioned before, it uses a Peltier effect, which uses the electric current to move temps from one side to another. We can see that as soon as we plug it, it has RGB, so surely it will give us more frames. But first, we can see with the thermal camera that it's very effective. We start with a temp of 27 degrees Celsius, and the moment we connect the cable, it starts to drop fast. In half a minute, we are below 20 degrees, and in about a minute and a half, it drops to 15 degrees. A difference of almost 12 degrees, quite good. And you can see the hot air coming out of the fan. And since I hadn't removed the protector, we can see some condensation starting to form. Now, so much cooling is useless if you don't have a way to transfer it. And for this, it's essential to have the best possible contact. That's why the heatsinks on the computer are screwed on, and the controller side rubbers now have a steeper slope, to force the phone to go down. The cooler part has less depth than the sides. This is to try to accommodate the different camera modules, and having the greatest amount of contact with the cooler. But this is a problem. Not only because it's flat, which means that phones with curved backs, like the Poco F2 and X3, don't have as much contact as you'd like, even when using a thermal pad that more or less adapts. But the biggest problem is that these phones are perfectly calibrated to its thermal capacity. Poco does an excellent job in this. We did the stress test, first with the phone alone, and then with the controller and the cooler on, and the result is exactly the same, 99.7 stability. The only major difference that I noticed is that the temperature on the screen dropped from 36 degrees to 30. There can be additional benefits using the cooler on this phone, but performance-wise, it's identical. But phones using the Snapdragon 888 and even more the newest 8 Gen 1 have a big temperature problem, so nothing better to test with than a Galaxy S22, because it significantly lowers its speed the hotter it gets. As an initial test, we can see that in the same stress test, the stability is just above 50%. That means that already hot, we cannot expect much more than 1200 points, and the heat transfer should be greater because the back is completely flat. But not as good as we thought. By putting it on, it just doesn't touch the cooler. The camera module got in the way, but this is easily solved by moving the fan position, and then it barely touches the phone. Even then, when testing, we saw a clear improvement. The stability went up to 70%, and the minimum score just above 1700 points. And to see how this reflects in games, we tested Genshin Impact, with the graphics to the max and with 60 FPS, and the difference is clear. With the fan on, the game always runs very close to 60 frames. It doesn't matter where you are in the game, inside the city or out in the forest. But as soon as we unplug the fan, the game slowly goes down until it reaches an average of 40 frames on the forest, and about 30 inside the city, which are the same numbers the phone gives you without a fan. A major change in performance. And when we plugged in the fan again, the frames slowly start to go up. Now, the contact with the cooler makes it far from ideal. So I did the test again, but this time forcing the contact with clamps. And weird, because it didn't change the result that much. Stability went up to 72%, but the difference is barely noticeable. And just for reference, the Red Magic 7 and the 7 Pro have a stability around 95%, and the scores around 2500 points. That means the fan on the controller is not a substitute for a proper thermal design, and as much as it uses the Peltier effect, it doesn't compare to a heatsink that sits in direct contact with the CPU, with an internal fan. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the reviews next week. And these phones are already in their thermal cap, so applying another cooler isn't going to change the result. The truth is that few processors need so much cooling, and as we saw with the Poco, if it's well calibrated, there is not much performance to gain, so its usefulness will depend a lot on the phone you have and which processor it uses. At $99 US, it's $30 more expensive than the X2, which puts it in a completely different price range. It is not a controller for someone who is looking for just a controller. It is for those who have a flagship phone and know that the temp is tampering its performance. But it has the same price as the Kishi version 2 that we saw the last week. And that one doesn't have any new features. And the backbone when they launch the USB-C version. which will have the headphone jack and the possibility of using it with a cable connected to the USB-C port. So, considering the inclusion of the Peltier cooler, which usually go for $50 or more, maybe it doesn't sound like a bad offer. And as we saw in the test, when it works, it lowers the temperature and can improve the performance. But it depends on your phone. The design of the cooler is not so universal. And I understand why. It's not an easy problem to solve. And thanks Gamesir for at least trying. There will be additional benefits to keeping the phone cooler, but these are very subjective points and hard to measure. They need to add something to force the phone to stay glued to the cooler. And if you add the other problem that the D-pad is, I would only recommend buying it somewhere where, if it doesn't work for you, they'll let you return it. And finally, this Gamesir X3 does not come to replace the X2. Surely, both will coexist in Gamesir's catalog, so don't forget to check its review where we compared it to the original Razer Kishi. Hope you liked this review and don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember, retro games, modern technology, zero to tech.